Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We are bringing you the latest on the indictment of sitting New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who has been indicted on a number of federal charges, including wire fraud, bribery, and solicitation of a contribution by a foreign national. All of this is in this 57-page federal indictment that was unsealed today after first being reported last evening. And as we've mentioned, Eric Adams is not intending at this point to resign. He says he will continue with his day-to-day work serving as mayor of New York City and is looking forward to defending himself against these charges. But we want to dig into what exactly these charges entail now and turn to June Grasso, who is the host of Bloomberg Law. This indictment is certainly something to behold, June. There's a number of allegations listed in here related to things like air travel, for example, on Turkish Airlines. According to this indictment, an Adams staffer actually texting with an airline official about the price of a ticket. The airline manager asking how much should be charged after floating $50. The staffer says his every step is being watched right now, $1,000 or so. Let it be somewhat real. We don't want them to say he is flying for free. With that kind of detail, June, just how damning is this indictment?
Well, it is very damning, and I want to call it like a speaking indictment. So anyone could read this and see what the prosecution, what the U.S. Attorney's Office alleges happened. It's a very simple indictment to read. You don't need to be a lawyer to look into it. So, and it outlined all the different trips he took or upgrades he got from Turkish Airlines and Turkish businessmen. I think what's interesting about the quote that you just read, there are a lot of quotes of texts between Adams staffers and Turkish officials, unnamed Turkish officials, or businessmen. But there are very few of Adams himself. There are some references to Adams saying something like, I'll handle that. But that stood out to me because if the U.S. Attorney's Office had those texts of Adams himself, I think they'd be in this indictment front and center. So that may be something that the Adams defense can work with. But, I mean, there's a lot of sort of what you'd consider undeniable evidence. And there's also not only that he took this, but that he created a straw map, sort of a fake map to try to make people think that he had paid for this. So he created a paper trail. Those are the two words I want. He created a paper trail, or tried to create a paper trail. So that is really something that a jury could, latch on to and say, well, obviously he knew what was going on if he's trying to create a paper trail to cover it up. So there's a lot of evidence here, and what also stands out is that he abused the New York Matching Funds Program, and I think they said to the extent of $10 million, where New York will match the donations you get. I believe it's $3 to $1, so that equal very quick. And what comes out is this was, the travel is one thing, and that goes back a decade. But this was about getting money for him to run for office in New York. I mean, you don't see a lot of, he got a gold watch from someone, or, personal, except for the travel, sort of personal benefits. It's about him trying to become mayor of New York and the cost of that and what he needed to do. So it's very, and I just want to say he has hired a celebrity entertainment, very, very good attorney, Alex Spiro. He represented different points. Jay-Z, Elon Musk. He's one of Elon Musk's favorite attorney. Alec Baldwin. So he's got already the top of criminal defense lawyers who's already put out statements about how this was a setup, and it was a dog and pony show at Gracie Mansion this morning. I mean, why did they have to raid Gracie Mansion? They already had his phones and texts, and the mayor said he would turn over whatever they wanted. So a lot there.
Well, it is a lot, and I wonder what kind of collective penalty, if he's actually found guilty of these crimes, he'd be looking at here, June.
I don't know what the crimes would, what the penalties would be. I mean, you've got to believe it's decades. But of course, this is something that, we always talk about. They're facing 100 years in prison, and no one gets that. It's the judge will look at. He has no prior convictions. Obviously, he's the mayor of a large city, and the judge would look at that and compare it. I mean, I can't believe, but we're really jumping the gun here because we have to go through. I mean, he hasn't even been arraigned yet, and that was another thing that his campaign brought out, that how they learned about this, and they complained about leaks from the U.S. Attorney's Office of grand jury information. The mayor mentioned that, as well as his attorney mentioned that in a statement. So it's a long way from conviction, but this is the same office that just won conviction against former Senator Bob Menendez. So public corruption is something that they do rather well here.
Yep, bribery charges, of course, in play in that case as well. June Grasso, host of Bloomberg Law, will be staying on top of this story for us all day here on Bloomberg Radio. We appreciate it very much, and we want to add another voice to this conversation now. I'm pleased to say joining me is Nick Akerman, former Watergate prosecutor, founder of the law office of Nick Akerman, and former assistant U.S. attorney. Nick, always great to see you. I almost struggle with where to begin in this, as we've been discussing extended indictment. I guess the question is, given the stature of this defendant in particular, a sitting mayor of the largest city in the country, how rock solid would the prosecution have needed to feel this case was in order to bring these charges forward?
Well, considering who the defendant is, they would have to feel extremely comfortable on the evidence. And it's pretty obvious from reading this indictment that they do. They lay it out in such detail. This is not a one-shot deal. This goes over a period of time, starting when he was involved in politics, a number of years ago in 2014, when he was the Brooklyn Bureau president. I mean, this goes way back. You've got very detailed evidence. You can pick out who the witnesses are. You can pick out where the emails are. You can pick out exactly who's testifying. This is absolutely, looks like on the surface, an overwhelming case for conviction.
Well, I wonder how long it would take to actually get to that point, though, Nick. And I would just point out, we have a headline crossing the terminal now that Adams is entitled to the presumption of innocence. This is according to the Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, of course, a member from the state of New York. He says the indictment of a sitting mayor is a serious and sober moment for New York City. Like every other New Yorker and American, Eric Adams is entitled to that presumption of innocence. That principle is central to the administration of justice in the United States of America. He goes on to say, in the meantime, I pray for the well-being of our great city. So with that kind of political consideration in mind here, Nick, it is worth pointing out that we're talking about a sitting mayor of New York who has been indicted. We are also talking about a Republican presidential candidate, the nominee, who has not just been indicted, but in fact convicted in the state of New York and indicted on a number of other crimes. What does this say about the political moment we are in when we're dealing with leaders at the highest levels who are so entangled in legal battles?
Well, I'm not sure there's something general you can take out of this. I mean, this has been going on for years. I used to be an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. Public officials were indicted back then. I was involved in the Watergate prosecution. We would have indicted the president, but for his pardon, all of his aides were indicted and spent time in jail. This has been going on for a long time, despite the fact that the Department of Justice and local DAs have been vigilant in going after public corruption. I think even though Mayor Adams does have the presumption of innocence here, the political problem posed by this indictment is overwhelming in the sense that it doesn't just allege general violations of the law. It gives very specific dates, times, places, benefits that he received in terms of travel, certain actions he did in return for those benefits that related to the New York City Fire Department, the New York City Buildings Department. It is so detailed. It is hard to imagine under these circumstances that he can continue as mayor.
Well, he, though, says that he will and that his day-to-day won't change. I guess you might take issue with that notion when you're fighting a legal battle like this one a bit, but it goes back to the original question I wanted to ask you about timing. How long would you expect this process to play out, considering, as June pointed out to us, he has not yet been arraigned, no arrest has taken place or anything like that? How long will it take for this to reach conclusion, would you estimate?
Oh, I think it's going to take at least 6 months, possibly a year. First of all, he's got to be arraigned. He's going to plead not guilty, I presume, based on his statements. There's then going to be pretrial motions. There's going to be discovery. That takes a long time. My sense is from reading this indictment, there's lots of witnesses. There's lots of documents. He has the right to have all of that material beforehand. Then after he gets all those documents, there'll be a time period for motions to be made. And then ultimately, the judge will have to decide on those motions. That takes time. This is not an uncomplicated case. In some ways, it's pretty straightforward and simple, but it's got a lot of witnesses, a lot of documents. I'm not sure there's too many legal issues here. Just looking at this indictment, this is going to be a hard one to get dismissed based on the face of the indictment, but they're going to try. And all of this does take time. And it just seems to me, based on the granularity of the allegations here and what's been identified, I think it's going to be very hard for him to continue acting as mayor, despite what he's saying now. He can say whatever he wants, but I think that once the reporters and the press start digging into the granularity of what is in here and identifying who the people are, the incidents that relate, for example, to the Turkish government building that he gave preference to with the fire department. All of these things can be verified by the press. And I think the more of this that comes out, the harder it is for him to be governing as mayor of New York.
Well, of course, he doesn't govern alone either. There is a whole city government to consider here as well. And we have seen, Nick, the resignations of some city officials, others who have had, who are close to Adams, who have had their homes raided. For example, as a prosecutor, how important should we be considering those other individuals into the ultimate case the prosecution will make here? This idea that people could maybe roll on him, is that what you would be trying to achieve if you were the Southern District of New York right now?
Oh, no question that's what they're trying to do. And it doesn't sound like this just relates to campaign contributions. It sounds like this is much broader than campaign contributions, that some of these other people who have resigned have done other things. The question is, what is the evidence on Mayor Adams? What will they say about Mayor Adams if they make a deal with the government? There's just so many people involved. So many people have resigned over the last couple months. We don't really know the complete scope and breadth of what's out there, but I think we're going to learn that as it goes along. But yes, I think he's in a whole world of hurt here because there's just too much. There's too many people that can come forward and testify against him.
And if this goes to jury trial, which I'm assuming is what the course of action will take us to here, how complicated is it to try to seat a jury in the city of New York when it's the mayor of New York in question? These are his constituents. Some of them may be people who voted for him. How complicated is this likely to get, Nick?
Well, I don't think it's going to be complicated. Look, they were able to get a jury for Donald Trump, who was the former president of the United States, and it didn't take more than a couple of days to do that. It's all done in the questioning of the jurors, which is known as the voir dire, to determine whether anybody has any preconceived notions or prejudices. This can all be done pretty quickly. You'd be surprised how many people have not focused on this, don't know anything about it, and are going to be clueless as to the facts of the case, and will be able to serve as good jurors on this case. So I don't see that being any kind of major obstacle in terms of delay, mainly because Donald Trump, they were able to get a jury on him in less than 2 days. I mean, this shouldn't be any different.
Well, fair enough. And of course, Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony charges in New York earlier this year. This is still an indictment. He does carry the presumption of innocence. Finally, Nick, before we let you go here, would you expect that because we've had this conversation in the Donald Trump case as well. If Eric Adams were to be found guilty of any or all of these crimes, could he serve time in prison?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it all depends on the federal sentencing guidelines. You'd have to look at the guidelines for each of these violations. You've got wire fraud, fraud on the city of New York, for being able to get matching funds from the city. You've got bribery and other violations here that it all depends on the federal sentencing guidelines and what they what the amounts of money involved, the seriousness of the crime, et cetera. So there's no way to know what that will be at this point, but it's serious.
All right, Nick Akerman, former Watergate prosecutor, thank you so much, as always, for joining us on this historic day as a sitting mayor of New York City is indicted on federal charges. We'll have much more still ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The indictment of New York City Mayor Eric Adams on bribery and fraud charges. He, of course, in the face of those, is saying he looks forward to defending himself and will continue to serve as mayor of New York City, despite some calls from both Republicans and Democrats who represent New York in Congress for him to resign. Not an outright call for that, though, from the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who, of course, represents a district in New York City. He says the indictment of a sitting mayor is a serious and sober moment for New York City. Like every other New Yorker in American, Eric Adams is entitled to the presumption of innocence. So we want to get into this now with our political panel. Joining me today is Rick Davis, Bloomberg politics contributor and Republican strategist, together with our Democratic strategist today, Kailey Legacki. Kailey, as the Democrat, I have to come to you first. What is the responsible way for Democrats to be responding to this? Frankly, one Democrat in particular, Eric Adams, should he resign?
Yes. I mean, if you read even the first page of his indictment, it's pretty alarming stuff. I expect that Leader Jeffries is working the phones pretty aggressively to help move Adams to the right decision. I think we would all get a lot of short-term satisfaction from Jeffries coming out immediately and calling on him to step aside. But what I have seen previously is that it's just typically a lot more effective to work behind the scenes and get these people to step aside than to call on them publicly. So, I fully expect that's what he's doing. And the indictment is so bad that I can't imagine that it lasts longer than a few days.
Well, Kailey, just to follow up, if he does not do it, though, if he cannot be convinced to resign, what do you expect the consequences will be for other Democrats who represent New York and its surrounding areas, some of whom might find themselves in tough races this cycle?
Yeah, I hope that Eric Adams, for once does the right thing and he steps aside. There are a handful of congressional seats in suburban New York City that are clear toss-ups. And if Eric Adams' goal is to help Republicans hold those seats, then yes, he should stay in office. But I think he's going to be in self-preservation mode. I wouldn't be surprised if he starts aligning himself with some characters who are unsavory, but who also argue that they are persecuted by the government. But I don't think it has a huge impact on individual races, but it's just a distraction that cuts away from the narrative that these candidates want to be driving in their own races. And it undermines confidence in government, which I think is bad for everyone.
Well, and Rick, on that point, I would love to bring you in on that. We're talking about the sitting mayor of New York City, who is now under federal criminal indictment. At the same time, we have a Republican presidential nominee who is under multiple indictments, in fact, has been convicted on charges in the state of New York already. What kind of moment in politics are we in right now?
A very litigious moment in politics. It seems to me most of the election year has been defined by indictments. Don't forget, senator from New Jersey. Also on that.
Yes.
So, I mean, it just goes on and on. And I would say this is an era that we are suffering through. Maybe there's a level of corruption and misbehavior that the era is going to be known for. But it's not positive. And I think Caitlin's right. I think that, I come from an era, maybe a bygone era, where a politician like Eric Adams would look at this and say, you know what, I can't do my job effectively for the people of New York. I want to live to fight another day, clear my name. So I'm going to step down, and clear my name and then come back hard. And there are examples where that has worked. And of course, he's not going to do that, not without a massive campaign with people like, the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who is a colleague from New York, who didn't take the opportunity to make that suggestion today. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes to get him to that point, because it is a massive political distraction in what is otherwise a intensely watched campaign around the country. And a day we're talking about Eric Adams is a day we're not talking about congressional candidates who have got tight races in New York or the presidential race. So it is legitimately a distraction of the people in New York.
Well, and I wonder about how it plays more broadly as well. Caitlin, just quickly here, Kamala Harris is running in part as a prosecutor. What should she be saying in response to this? Does she have a role to play?
I think she has a role to play in terms of fighting for the rule of law. I think that's where you'll see her draw a clear contrast, is that she believes that we live in a country where everyone is equally accountable to the law, whereas Donald Trump does not. I don't think she's going to want to weigh in on the individual allegations, just because she understands as a prosecutor that you don't want to get in the middle of an ongoing legal process. But I do think that, she is a prosecutor. She has a strong record on this. And it gives her another opportunity to remind voters, some of whom possibly still don't know that Donald Trump has been indicted, that there is a clear distinction there, and that she's going to continue to make that argument.
All right, Caitlin Legacki and Rick Davis, our political panel today. Thank you so much. We'll have much more with them in our next hour of Balance of Power, but we want to turn now to a representative in Congress from the state of New York. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis is with me now. She represents New York's 11th congressional district. Her constituency covers Staten Island and southern Brooklyn, so areas of New York that are very much affected by this news. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. You already have called today for either the resignation of Eric Adams or his removal by Governor Hochul. Why exactly does he need to resign when not being found yet guilty of these crimes, when Donald Trump is still running for president, having been found guilty of crimes and indicted on many others?
Well, first of all, we have a city right now that is in peril. And I think that this is a major distraction for the mayor. I think the mayor needs to focus on these serious charges. You have to remember that there are multiple people within his cabinet that have resigned. So I think this is really the tip of the iceberg. But it has made this city really failing. It's failing. And people are suffering as a result. We have so many problems right now: skyrocketing crime. We have this mass illegal migration. We have our hotels have been taken over with these lucrative contracts to be operated as migrant shelters, and the people in them are committing crimes. And they are wreaking havoc in our city, rapes, shooting at police officers. We have an education system that is failing, and a chancellor that just said he was going to resign at the end of the year. We have a police commissioner recently resigned when we have serious public safety issues. So the city is becoming completely mismanaged, and the mayor is distracted. And the best thing for him to do is to step aside to deal with these issues. And that is, I think, the best thing for the city, although I am concerned that we may end up with somebody worse than Mayor Adams. But I think it's the right thing to do if we are going to have any hope of restoring some sanity to this city, to make it governable again, and to really give New Yorkers the government that it deserves.
Well, of course, if he does choose to resign, which at this point he maintains he will not, acting mayor would be put into place. Then a special election would be held to choose a replacement. Congresswoman, would you be interested in the role? Should it be vacated?
Look, I ran in 2017. People have made it clear they don't necessarily want a Republican being the mayor of New York City. I think that we have to, though, collectively find a candidate that is palatable across the political spectrum, somebody that could have like a business background, somebody who can really take the problems that we're facing as a city and bring some management. One of the biggest problems facing our city right now is the fact that they're contracting hundreds of billions of dollars out to like nonprofit organizations. This is work that should be doing, number one, within the city government. And the government has just gotten so big and so broad, they're outsourcing so much of its responsibility in areas where the city shouldn't even be focusing. So we need to get the city budget under control. We need to make sure that we're actually using taxpayer money wisely for the things that we need in this city: transportation, infrastructure, public safety, a good education for our children. Those should be the top focuses, not providing billions of dollars in taxpayer funds to citizens of other countries who came into the country legally and are even committing crimes. So I think that I would like to see somebody like a Mike Bloomberg run again, somebody who has a business background, knows how to manage a large organization, and somebody who would be more of a centrist that Republicans and Democrats and independents can embrace, because this city has gone way too far to the left, and we're paying for the policies of Bill de Blasio and Eric Adams. But remember, the reason why this is a sanctuary city, not deporting people committing crimes in our city, is because of Bill de Blasio and the far left council. So we need somebody who's going to bring it more to the center.
At this point, Congressman, I will disclose that Michael Bloomberg is the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, which owns Bloomberg Media and this radio network. But we appreciate your thoughts as always. I do wonder about your thoughts as well on what this does. We know that New York's congressional districts are very much battleground zones in this election. Some of your colleagues are in tough races. Do you think whatever detrimental effect this may have on New York City, there is some benefit for your colleagues in this news? Does it make it easier for Republicans to keep the House?
Well, look, I think that the fact that there's been quite a few Democrats that have had to resign in disgrace at the city and state level over the past few years may bring some benefit to Republicans. I think maybe people see that, we need some type of balance and common sense in our government and elect honorable people, not just by party label, but people that are actually going to do the job and do it right and do it honestly. But certainly I see no joy in seeing my city being torn apart right now, and the issues that we're facing that need desperate leadership and management, real management. And I'm very concerned about the future of our city. I've been concerned for quite some time. Over the last 8 years, it has taken a real downward turn, and we need to put somebody in the helm that is going to correct this ship, or else we're going to have real fiscal problems for forever. And I don't know that New York City can return if we don't fix it now.
Congresswoman, I have less than a minute left here, but one of your Republican colleagues has also faced some allegations within the last week about corruption and more specifically actually paying those close to him to serve in his office with taxpayer dollars. Anthony D'Esposito, should he resign as well?
Well, what we've done in the past, we've referred to ethics committee to do an investigation. Based on what I've seen so far, there has been nothing that's been that violated any laws taking place. But should we find out more information, then we should handle that accordingly when the time is appropriate. As you know, I've had no problem calling for George Santos to resign. I voted to expel him.
I do remember.
So I have no problem calling on those of my party when it's proven that they've done something illegal and wrong.
All right, Congresswoman, really appreciate you hopping on with us as we deal with this historic news in New York. That is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York. Appreciate your time joining us on a day in which, as we've been telling you here on Bloomberg Radio, Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted on federal bribery and fraud charges. We will continue to follow this story.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We're going to continue this conversation now and move to other subjects as well as we head to Capitol Hill, where we find Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, who also, of course, is a vocal surrogate for the Trump campaign. Congressman, always great to see you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Obviously, we are seeing another indictment of a very high-profile political figure in American politics. Donald Trump himself, as you well know, has come under multiple indictments as well. Do you see any parallels between this Adams case and the Trump ones?
I really don't, because you're talking about two very different issues. If you look at the indictments of President Trump, you're talking about novel legal theories, never been tried before, where they tried to basically push a square peg into a round pole to try to get the top Republican in the United States, the nominee for the president of the United States, and Donald J. Trump, versus what appears to be, according to the allegations against Eric Adams, a very deep and massive campaign finance violation, where they were bringing wire fraud charges, etc. The very scheme is very different altogether. They're using tried and true criminal charges against the mayor of New York versus these insane novel legal theories trying to criminalize Donald Trump. They are very two things, and I could go step by step with you through every one of these indictments, but the two are not the same. And I think we got to be careful not to try to make it seem as that now the Department of Justice is operating with clean hands all the time. What we have seen on Capitol Hill is that that is not the case.
Well, Congressman, as we consider the difference in these cases here, I was just speaking with one of your Republican colleagues from New York, Nicole Malliotakis, who was talking about how, frankly, city leadership just doesn't need this distraction because the city needs to run. And it's at that point I would point out that many of these cases against Donald Trump have not been wrapped up yet. In fact, he hasn't been sentenced in the case in which he was actually convicted. Why should New Yorkers worry about the distraction of having to fight a legal battle on the part of the New York City mayor, but not worry about the distractions that could face a president of the United States?
Well, this is a great question, and let me unfold that. Number one, the charges that have been brought, in my view, ridiculously against Donald Trump will have no bearing whatsoever on his ability to run the United States of America. Why would I say that? Number one, these charges that were brought around Mar-a-Lago documents, the same stuff could have been charged against Joe Biden. The Department of Justice did not charge Joe Biden. And the reason why they didn't do that is because they said he was a well-meaning old man. He was facing the same investigation. I would say Joe Biden's done a terrible job, but it's not stopped him from doing his job. When it comes to Eric Adams in New York, and this is why I'm saying it's important that you cannot try to create some moral equivalency between these two situations. What Eric Adams apparently is facing is dealing with major campaign finance violations. And I mean major to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars from overseas. Very different matter than the ridiculous indictments brought to us by Jack Smith, Merrick Garland, the ridiculous RICO charges down in Georgia that make no sense at all, and obviously what happened in Lower Manhattan, where they had to reach into the past for something that the Federal Election Commission even said there was no there in New York. They basically tried to make a crime that did not exist. That's wrong, and that's not going to stop Donald Trump from being able to lead our country and get our country back on track and making America great again.
Congressman, I'd like to ask you about the business of your chamber as well, as we find you on Capitol Hill today, having yesterday, of course, seen the House and the Senate pass a 3-month continuing resolution to keep the government funded until December 20th. I understand you were a no on that bill, and I wonder what you make of the way Speaker Johnson handled all of this, knowing his original plan for a 6-month CR with the SAVE Act attached didn't make it through. It had to go with this clean CR plan B. Does he deserve to be Speaker again if the House is able to maintain, the Republicans, that is, the majority?
Well, look, I think the first answer to your core question is yes. Mike Johnson's in a tough spot. It's been a very difficult Congress to navigate. I will add that one of the reasons we are at this point here on Capitol Hill is because Chuck Schumer, Senate Democrats, and the White House have done nothing with respect to trying to find common sense solutions to funding the government going forward. In the House, under the leadership of Mike Johnson, we passed 5 of the 12 appropriation bills, which fund 73% of the government. What did the Senate do? I will tell you what the Senate did under Chuck Schumer's leadership. They did nothing. They did no homework. They passed no bills. They came with no solutions. They didn't even try to work on this over the summer months. They basically sat in the Senate and just waited to the last minute, which is typical of Washington, D.C., to wait to the last minute so you're forced to deal with some massive bill to avoid a shutdown, which I did vote against because I don't believe we should be doing that right now. But then you set up a situation where you go into a Christmas omnibus that nobody reads. It is the same song and dance in Washington, D.C. That's at the feet of Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, because they've had months to come to an agreement with House Republicans on federal spending. They have chosen not to. So I think what people really need to understand is that it's a difficult situation, whether it was Mike Johnson or Kevin McCarthy or Paul Ryan or John Boehner or any other Republican speaker, because the truth on Capitol Hill is that Senate Democrats and House Democrats, for that matter, do not want to negotiate spending in an orderly manner where people can come to compromise. They want to wait for the last minute where you're dealing with a take it or leave it deal, and you have members on Capitol Hill who don't want the American people to be left in the lurch. It is an indictment of the process here. Democrats need to step up and do their job for once.
And of course, we all have questions as to whether or not the deal that former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who you just mentioned, and the deal he did strike with Democrats will stand ultimately at the end of the day, especially that side deal we have all heard so much about. I'd like to ask you as well, Congressman, about what's happening in the Capitol today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is there visiting with some of your colleagues before he meets with Biden and Harris later this afternoon. Many of your Republican colleagues have had criticism for Zelensky with some of the comments he has made about Donald Trump while here in the U.S. in the last week, as well as a visit to Pennsylvania, and specifically a plant that is making ammunition that is helping Ukraine in this war. Mike Johnson, the speaker, did call for the firing of the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. over that visit. What is your thought on all of this?
I agree with Mike Johnson, and here's why. You now have a foreign leader who's now making plant visits in one of the key battleground states in our presidential election. Vladimir Zelensky is now talking tough or talking badly about Donald Trump, and he's here. Obviously, he's going to have meetings with the president and members on Capitol Hill. But that stop in Pennsylvania was highly political in the middle of a presidential election. You know, the Democrats would lecture us about foreign influence in our elections. Well, what demonstrates foreign influence any more than the leader of a foreign nation touring a facility in a battleground state 40 days before a presidential election? This is outrageous. But I just want to be very clear with your viewers. The reason why this is allowed to occur is because most of the media will not question Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. That's if Kamala Harris or Joe Biden are even available to answer your questions. And they have no problem taking whatever help they feel they need from anywhere around the globe to win an election. It is election interference. It is wrong. And that's why Mike Johnson has made his stance. I stand with him in that. And my colleagues on Capitol Hill, we need to be investigating this, because you can't have foreign leaders coming into our country laying down their markers of who should be the next commander in chief for our nation.
And finally, Congressman, with your district in mind, in our last minute with you, we all are obviously watching Hurricane Helene as well as it barrels toward Florida. Could be an incredibly strong storm. What does the state of Florida need in preparation and potentially in the aftermath? Is it not getting anything that it needs?
Well, look, I know our governor has been in contact with FEMA. They've already been working on this. In Florida, unfortunately, yes, we deal with hurricanes. Our leadership knows how to get this done. I know Governor DeSantis has already pre-positioned assets in key areas to respond to the aftermath of the storm. In my district, we were hit with Hurricane Ian 2 years ago. We worked with the governor of our state. We worked with FEMA and other partners to try to build back our area very quickly. Florida, unfortunately, is accustomed to this. We will get through it once again, and we'll be working with everybody to make sure that the people of Florida are restored and they get back on their feet as quickly as possible.
All right, Congressman, appreciate your time today, sir. That is Republican Congressman Byron Donald of the state of Florida. Thank you so much, and stay safe out there if you're heading home in the next few days. This, of course, is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We will have much more ahead.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Here in the U.S., which of course follows a big update in the Asian session, specifically for Chinese equities, which rallied more than 4% in the aftermath of new promises from the Politburo as they aim, they say, to revive growth with pledges to support fiscal spending and to stop the declining they see in the property sector. More promises of stimulus coming to shore up the world's second largest economy. And our next guest just actually returned from a visit to China to discuss some of their macroeconomic issues. I'm pleased to say joining me here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Jay Shambaugh. He is the U.S. Treasury Under Secretary for International Affairs. Sir, thank you so much for being with us. As I mentioned, you just returned from China for, I believe, your fifth round of talks with your economic counterparts there. Part of what you were planning to raise were issues of Chinese overcapacity, the concern that China is generating so much that they don't necessarily have demand for at home and therefore flooding the global markets with it. Do the stimulus measures that we have seen China outline over the course of the last week satisfy some of your concern? Do they go far enough to revive the domestic demand in China?
Well, first, thanks very much for having me here. What I would say is I'm glad to see the Chinese senior policymakers talking about a lack of demand in the economy, about the need to support growth in the economy, especially from domestic demand. I don't know that I've seen anything concrete yet that I think would really answer the mail on that, but I think it's an important step that they are acknowledging that domestic demand needs to go faster and that they need to support their growth with consumption and with domestic demand. I think, when as you mentioned, we were there for what we call the Economic Working Group. I led a kind of senior delegation of Treasury officials there to talk to senior Chinese policymakers. And one of the key points we raised with them is that their savings rate is really high. That leads to this huge kind of imbalance in their economy unless they can drive some sort of demand for it. And otherwise, what they've been doing is channeling that savings towards subsidies to manufacturing industry, producing a lot that they don't have domestic demand for. And that's what I'd like to see more of. And I think it's a good start to see them talk about it. I think we need to see more concrete policies.
Did you sense, sir, that your counterparts are understanding of those concerns and maybe thinking about wider behavioral changes in that regard? What was the reception like when you raised these things?
So this is something we've been talking to the Chinese about for quite a while. I'd say that in one of our trips in February, we really pushed the point quite hard. And then when Secretary Yellen was there in April of this year, she really tried to lay out the case for why this was a problem for both the world economy and really why it was a problem for the Chinese economy. You don't want to subsidize a lot of firms that are losing money. It's inefficient. It's a waste of fiscal resources. It's also just low productivity for your economy. So one of our advantages, frankly, at Treasury right now is we have a world-renowned economist leading Treasury. And so people take her seriously when she's there, and they really do want to listen to her. From a political perspective, they certainly push back on the narrative of overcapacity. But I think what we're seeing on the policy grounds are steps, hopefully, that will lead to ones in the right direction.
Well, to your point, sir, on Secretary Yellen, do you expect we will see another meeting between her and He Lifeng before this administration is over?
I'm not sure. I think both sides view this channel as a really important one. And that's one reason I was just there, was to make sure that we could keep robust engagement. We've always said it's not tenable to have the two largest world economies not talk to each other. And one thing the Secretary has often said is we need to talk about the things we agree about and where we can work together. But it's equally as important, if not more so, to talk about the things where we don't agree. And so we try to go and do both.
Cooperation and competition, if you will, sir. I do wonder, especially given some of the rhetoric we're seeing on the campaign trail from Donald Trump, which I won't ask you to comment directly on, but he, of course, is talking about implementing higher tariffs on Chinese exports. Do you see tariffs as a mechanism to address some of these overcapacity concerns, essentially raise the cost of some of these goods that are being made so that people don't want to import them and that supply doesn't actually hit foreign markets? What is the proper role of trade-specific measures here?
So we have used trade tools already. I think narrowly targeted and strategic trade measures can sometimes try to either shift the calculus for a specific product or, for that matter, maybe change the other countries' strategy a little bit. So I think narrowly targeted strategic tariffs can be a useful tool. One of the reasons we've been trying to have this conversation with China is to make clear that it won't just be the U.S. doing this. You'll see this happening from a lot of countries, and that if they do start to see whether it's tariffs or other trade measures, they shouldn't think of it as us attacking China or us being against China. They should recognize that this is really defensive on our part, and China in some sense has agency here. They can change their own policies in ways that would not lead to the rest of the world putting tariffs on their goods.
Of course, sir, while the U.S.'s focus is on its own relationship with China, there is concern as well about China's relationship with other countries, including adversaries like Russia. We, of course, saw Secretary Yellen earlier this year warning about companies providing material support, Chinese companies, that is, to Russia's war, whether it's through banking or other goods, that if they are providing the support, they risk being sanctioned by the U.S. Have you started to see behavioral changes on the parts of Chinese banks or other companies when it comes to dealing with Russia?
So this is a topic that we talk about a lot with our counterparts. They recognize this is something that is a serious strategic interest of ours. And so China has said many times that they have no intention of allowing lethal aid to go to Russia. Where we've been really pressing them is on dual-use goods that could be used by Russia to kind of build up their war machine. What we've made clear is that if financial firms are processing transactions towards sanctioned entities or with these dual-use goods, they're exposed to sanctions. Large Chinese banks understand that connectivity to the U.S. financial system and the global financial system is essential for them, and so neither those firms nor their regulators want them to do anything that runs afoul of our sanctions. So a lot of this is doing the hard work of making clear what really would expose you to risk and what wouldn't, what exactly we're trying to get firms not to do. Sometimes that can lead to where we've had to sanction a firm, not financial firms so far, but we have had to sanction a few Chinese firms because we felt that they were crossing lines. And what we try to do through dialogue is, in some sense, stop the behavior before it ever happens and before we have to take sanctions.
And finally, sir, in our last minutes with you here, I'd like to ask you kind of a wider question. It does relate to Russian behavior as well. The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and one of the great breadbaskets of the world, a hot war in the Middle East as well, where, of course, a lot of energy is centered. How concerned are you when you look at the global economic outlook and some of these risks that are present about things that could refuel inflation, for example, or otherwise be disruptive to a global economy and a U.S. economy, frankly, that to this point has been able to hold in there, even as we've seen inflationary pressures come down?
Look, I'm an economist by training, and so I worry about everything. But that being said, I think what we know is that geostrategic risks or geopolitical risks are always out there. What we try to do is minimize any potential impact on the U.S. economy. As you noted, I think we've seen a really strong U.S. economy. I think it was a Bloomberg poll maybe a year and change ago where 100% of the people polled thought we'd have a recession in 23. We didn't. We got through the year with actually quite strong growth, and we've managed to see inflation come down while the unemployment rate has stayed at a fairly historically low level. That's despite a lot of challenges around the globe. We're obviously doing everything we can at Treasury and across the U.S. government to minimize any of those challenges, to prevent disruptions to energy markets or food markets or things like that that could damage the world economy and really blow back on U.S. consumers. So we think about it all the time, we worry about it all the time, but we are hopefully taking the steps that would prevent those shocks from really reverberating here.
All right, Jay Shambaugh, the U.S. Treasury Under Secretary for International Affairs. Greatly appreciate your time today, sir. Thank you so much for being here with us on Balance of Power. Now, of course, the other big story we're following here on Balance of Power comes from New York with the federal indictment of Mayor Eric Adams on bribery and fraud charges. We want to dig more into the actual charges he is facing now and turn to Dave Aronberg, who is state attorney for Palm Beach County in Florida, but is in New York today. It is the place to be in the news today. Dave, great to have you back here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Obviously, there's a number of federal charges here, allegations of accepting illegal contributions, including from foreign agents. How serious are these charges as a prosecutor? How easy is this case to prosecute? How hard will the defense be for Mayor Adams?
Kailey, good to be with you. The challenge is proving intent, that Adams knew that he was accepting illegal campaign contributions and bribes. It's much easier to prove the free gifts, the air travel, that kind of stuff. But really, the bread and butter of this indictment is the wire fraud accusation, which is a federal prosecutor's best friend. It's relatively easy to prove, and it can get you up to 20 years in prison. He's facing up to 45 years in total. I think the stuff that was laid out in the indictment shows that Adams allegedly was trying to obstruct, was trying to hide his involvement in all this, changing his passwords on his phone, trying to cover up the documents that would have shown that he took these trips and these campaign contributions. So they've got a good case against him. After all, they're not going to go after the powerful mayor of New York City unless they've got the goods.
Well, yeah, that was a question I had when this news first dropped. How ironclad does a case need to be to essentially make a sitting mayor of the country's largest city a criminal defendant? It was raised to me, though, earlier on the program, Dave, this notion that while this indictment is vivid in detail in terms of messaging and texting that was exchanged with Adams staffers and various others, included representatives from Turkish Airlines, for example, when it comes to some of this travel, not much of it is actual messaging from Adams himself. Is that a complicated factor here for the prosecution?
It'd be better if you have his own words, but they do have the cell phones and the computers of a lot of his associates. And that's how you know that the feds are serious. Once they have your electronic communications, something's going to go down. They've been investigating this for a while. I mean, they've traced this back for 9 years that he's allegedly received these improper benefits. And then they were specific that the alleged bribe occurred when the Turkish government sought to get an expedited approval of this 30-story consulate that was ready to go, except the fire department said that doesn't meet code. Well, they invested, allegedly, in Adams, and then Adams supposedly leaned on the fire department, and the certificate of occupancy was granted thereafter. So that's where you have your bribery, that's where you have your wire fraud in part, and then you have the abuse, allegedly, of the matching contribution laws in New York, where you're entitled to get matching campaign contributions if it comes from an individual donor. So then the Turkish government apparently funneled the money through individuals so that it could then be multiplied under the campaign finance laws. So he'd get advantage of that, and that's where he's also being charged. So he's got a lot of problems ahead, and I would suspect that some of the people closest to him will flip on him to save their own hides.
Well, and we have seen the resignation of a number of city officials, others who, of course, have had their own property searched over the course of the last several months as this corruption investigation was ongoing. Is that really what's the linchpin, the critical point here for the prosecution, is to get those flips to actually happen?
That matters a lot, to have him on the stand. Adams has some very prominent attorneys representing him. So the feds are going to have to come with all their firepower here. That means flipping witnesses who know where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. Also using the electronic communications against Adams. One interesting anecdote in the indictment is that Adams apparently was tipped off that he was about to be searched, having his phone seized. So when the feds got his phones, he didn't have his personal phone on him. That was left at home or wherever. And then he previously had changed the password on that personal phone. The personal phone is where the more incriminating stuff apparently was. And he changed the password, made it much harder for the feds to access. And so he apparently knew what he was doing, and that's going to be used against him too. It's all about intent.
Finally, Dave, in our final moment with you, I'd like to ask you about a legal case much closer to home in Florida, which, of course, was the attempted assassination of Donald Trump just weeks ago. The man, Ryan Ruth, who was initially charged with firearms charges related to that, was indicted on an attempted assassination charge just this week. How does that case move forward from here?
The feds are doing a good job. First, they started with the low-hanging fruit, the firearms offenses. That kept Ruth in jail, and then they came back after the evidence was developed to charge Ruth with attempted assassination. That can get the guy up to life in prison. So when Governor DeSantis and former President Trump accused the feds of small ball, no, they're going for it all here because they've got that handwritten note from Ruth that shows that he did apparently intend to assassinate Donald Trump. So the feds are going to move forward with this. Ruth will continue to plead not guilty. I don't think he gets a plea deal out of this unless it involves decades in prison. So he's not going anywhere anytime soon.
All right. Dave Aronberg, the state attorney for Palm Beach County. Always great to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We appreciate your time. And of course, Bloomberg will be staying on top of this story.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We're keeping an eye on not just those down-ballot campaigns, the presidential campaign as well, as this has been, I think we could call it economy week for the presidential candidates, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris giving speeches in key battleground states this week outlining their different policy proposals, some of them specifically targeted, for example, at manufacturing. Harris spoke in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania yesterday, and after doing so, sat down for an interview on MSNBC where she faced more questions around these proposals and some questions around the proposals of her opponent, Donald Trump. Here's one thing she said to Stephanie Ruhle yesterday.
Part of it is you don't just throw around the idea of just tariffs across the board, and that's part of the problem with Donald Trump. Frankly, I'm going to, and I say this in all sincerity, he's just not very serious about how he thinks about some of these issues. And one must be serious and have a plan, and a real plan that's not just about some talking point ending in an exclamation at a political rally, but actually putting the thought into what will be the return on the investment and what will be the economic impact on everyday people.
So we want to get more into those questions now and turn to Rohit Kumar, who is principal and co-leader of Washington's National Tax Services at PwC and former domestic policy director and deputy chief of staff to Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, here with me in our Washington, D.C. studio. It's good to see you as always, Rohit. She suggested that some of the ideas put forward by Trump, including around blanket tariff policy, she called them not serious policies. Would you agree with that characterization?
No, I think they are serious policies, and I think people dismiss them at their own peril. Congress, over the last almost 100 years, has actually delegated quite a bit of authority to the executive. Those authorities have never been tested in the way that former President Trump is talking about testing them. So one assumes that if he actually does the things that he's saying he's going to do, that ends up in litigation, and the courts will ultimately adjudicate the question. But I think one thing that is lost in this conversation, so, there's a criticism of the tariff policy, which is that, well, this is a cost that's ultimately borne by regular consumers,
Harris
by the middle
is calling
class.
it a sales tax.
A sales tax, right, which is actually not too different than the way most of Western Europe funds its government, but that's maybe a separate question. I think what's lost in this conversation is there is a little bit of intentional fiction being engaged, which is these tariffs borne by middle class consumers, et cetera, but like the corporate tax increases that Vice President Harris is proposing, embracing many of the Biden proposals, that those somehow come out of out of a money tree that sits in a corporate boardroom or something like that. But the truth is, and there's a ton of academic research on this question, corporate tax increases, corporations at some level don't actually have their own money. They have other people's money, right? They have the money of their workers, their customers, and their shareholders. And so when you raise corporate taxes, it comes from some combination of workers, customers, and shareholders. And the academic data sort of varies what's the distribution of the burden, but it's roughly half, some would say it's half customers, some would say half labor. No one thinks it's all shareholders. And even if it were all shareholders, 61% of the public owns shares. So all of these proposals that are being kicked around, the cost of it is ultimately borne to the extent that we actually pursue any of these policies. That's a separate question for Congress ultimately perhaps to adjudicate. The cost is borne by largely the same population of individuals. It just shows up in slightly different ways. Okay, so I guess it raises the question of what is the more responsible policy to fill the Treasury's coffers if you're looking at tax cuts or credits for certain portions of the population, which they both are. Do tariffs work as that offset, or does it have to be higher taxes of some form, corporate or otherwise? Tariffs would work.
What's the economic consequence of that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because the tariff play is a little more complicated because it's not just one bounce of the ball. You raise tariffs, and some other sort of third-party estimators have suggested that the tariffs at sort of the low end of what former President Trump is talking about could raise $300 billion a year or $3 trillion over the ensuing decade. Just as a reminder, the tax cuts that expire at the end of 2025, to fill that hole completely, if you wanted to extend all that tax relief, that would cost about $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. This is real money even for the U.S. government. So tariffs could, hypothetically fill a substantial piece, if not the entirety of that hole. So it is real. It is certainly there. And likewise on President or Vice President Harris, potentially President Harris's side of the ledger, you raise the corporate tax rate to 28%. That's worth at least $1 trillion or so of additional revenue. It could be more depending on where you draw the line. Again,
Sure.
though, these are campaign proposals.
Right. And as you pointed out, you need Congress to
You
implement
need
of
Congress
this.
on corporate or any tax policy changes.
Sure.
That requires
Not tariffs.
Congress's
Sure.
kind of blessing. The tariff play, potentially, right? And again, these authorities have not been tested in the way that former President Trump is talking about testing them, but potentially tariffs could be done by executive authority. They could certainly be done by Congress, but separate question about whether you'd have the votes in Congress to do this.
Well, and with that question, what are you telling clients right now at PwC about what you think is realistic, knowing that there could be divided government? Are there areas of tax policy you do expect will change regardless of who is in ultimate control?
I do, yeah. So, on the sort of good news side, for lack of a better term, both parties have agreed that no one making less than $400,000 should experience this automatic tax increase that happens at the end of 2025. So that is now like table stakes in a divided government or even in unified control, no matter which party had unified control. Both parties say no one less than $400,000 should experience this automatic tax increase. That's about 95% of all income tax payers in the country. There will be a negotiation in divided government of the more than $400,000 crowd. There'll be a negotiation over the pass-through deduction, the estate tax exemption, all the other child tax credit, which gets cut in half at the end of 2025. Although there's, I think, general consensus that letting that cut in half is not preferred policy. And look, I don't know who the next president's going to be, but if former President Trump becomes President Trump again, then you have to take this tariff question quite seriously and start looking at, well, do we import product? Where do we import it from? Is there a domestic alternative? And the like. So these are the kind of scenario planning questions we're going through.
Well, and as we continue to do so, please come back and talk to us more
Always
about
happy
it. Wish
to.
we had more time today. Rohit Kumar is principal and co-leader of Washington National Tax Services at PwC, and of course, former deputy chief of staff to Mitch McConnell in the Senate.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.